Can you go into a little bit more detail of how to understand LDL? Because most people, when they think about LDL cholesterol, they just think of like this waxy substance that's in our bloodstream that ends up getting into the arterial beds, creates inflammation that clogs our arteries. And
Right.
that's really all they know about it.
So I'm going to put a pin in a topic that I want to return to, which is separating the physiology from the risk profile. And also the idea that just because something's adaptive, it means it's safe. So
Yeah.
we'll get to that in a minute, but I will answer your question and explain the lipid energy model, which is a physiological metabolic explanation for why lean mass hyperresponders manifest. And basically, the idea is if you have a lean, insulin sensitive person, when they go low carb and the carb stores in their liver drop, they really shift rapidly towards fat fuel trafficking, which means fatty acids are released from their adipocytes, their fat cells. So your fat cells are spilling out fatty acids, which in fasting and carbohydrate restriction occurs more in lean people. That's already known.
Mm-hmm.
And your muscle tissue will like locally gobble up the fat cells. They get fuel, but there's a lot of fatty acids circulating around. So what ends up happening with those is they go back to the liver, and the liver takes them up, and the liver will repackage these fatty acids by appending three to a glycerol backbone, so you end up with this like M-shaped molecule. It's a storage form of fat called triglycerides, and those triglycerides, they're fatty. Fat doesn't mix with water, right? So you need a way to traffic them around the body, get them back to the fat cells to replenish the fat cells, and to muscle cells to continue to fuel muscle cells. So you take these triglycerides and you package them on triglyceride-rich lipoproteins. The main one being exported from the liver is called very low-density lipoprotein, VLDL. So you package these big spheres, kind of like boats, trafficking the triglycerides. You package these VLDL with triglycerides that get shipped out of the liver. Then what happens is these big VLDL will go back to fat tissue and muscle tissue, where the triglycerides in their center will be sucked out by lipoprotein lipase. So this enzyme that breaks down the triglycerides so the fatty acids can go back into the fat tissue and into muscle tissue. And so it's really this process of the VLDL packed with triglycerides getting exported at a much higher rate to replenish fat cells and fuel muscle cells, coupled with the turnover of the short-lived VLDL, so that the VLDL is getting turned over, the triglycerides are getting sucked out rapidly, right? So let's think about the triad. Triglycerides getting sucked out rapidly to replenish fat cells and fuel muscle tissue. So the triglycerides are going to go down. Okay, one point of the triad, low triglycerides. What happens when you shrink the VLDL? It becomes an LDL, which sticks around longer. The VLDL is short-lived, the LDL are longer-lived. So you're left over with more LDL. So LDL is high, 0.2 of the triad. The last point of the triad is the HDL. And HDL cholesterol goes up in lean mass hyperresponders because when you shrink the VLDL, the triglycerides get sucked out, the VLDL becomes a smaller LDL. Well, when you shrink a sphere, you need to shrink its surface area. And there are surface components, including cholesterol, that get kind of taken off and taken up by acceptor particles, which are HDL particles. And so the amount of cholesterol in your HDL goes up. So you're left with this triad of the high LDL, the high HDL, and the low triglycerides. That is the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype. And this all occurs because of a shift in fuel demand from carbs to fat and the spinning of this flywheel that is the lipid energy model. So that's our physiologic understanding. And by understanding that model, or let's even call it a hypothesis, it's both, but we can use the more humble term, you can make predictions using this hypothesis. And one of those would be, say, adding back carbs should stop the flywheel. LDL goes down. We see that. Or increasing exercise, cardiovascular exercise. Then you need more energy. Should increase the flywheel. Does LDL go up? Yeah, we see that too.
Mm-hmm.
There are different ways to intervene in order to test the predictions of this model. And thus far, even the boldest predictions, like Oreo cookie addition to your diet, have proven to be, or have borne out to be, consistent with the model. So that's the model. I'll pause for questions. Then I want to talk about what the model means and does not mean with respect to risk, because I think it's important to caveat.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. And, to add in, and this is a hypothesis, is that insulin is like the key lever. So like when insulin is beyond a certain threshold in certain individuals, so if it's above the threshold, their fat burning is lowered, right? Because it helps block
Yes.
lipolysis or the breakdown of fatty acids for fuel. And when it gets below a certain threshold, in a sense, it kind of takes its foot off the brake, and now the body's just going into higher degree of fat burning. And
Mhm.
so we just don't know where kind of that threshold is. And it could be unique for each individual. Like we don't even know if there's an actual set point, but we do know that these individuals have very low insulin, like you were
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah, I would say that a question that arises that I haven't fully answered is, oh, but why in lean insulin sensitive people does this manifest and not in people with obesity? What I can say is this is certainly consistent with the literature that exists, which we go through in the lipid energy model paper, which if you can feel free to link in
Yeah.
the podcast notes. So it's consistent with clinical data, say in lean people versus people with obesity in fasting and carbohydrate restriction. Um, we don't know the exact profile metabolically. What is the hormonal milieu that permits
Yeah.
this to occur? And I think one key ingredient in the hormone soup, so to speak, is insulin. So you're right. If insulin is high, you're kind of going to put a lock on liberating free fatty acids, which occurs at the beginning of the lipid energy model cycle. If you want to add a beginning, so I do think if someone's insulin resistant and hyperinsulinemic, then it does provide an inhibition to the lipid energy model moving forward. But that doesn't mean that low insulin is sufficient for the lipid energy model
Right.
to manifest. But I'd be surprised if it wasn't necessary to some extent. Low insulin.
Yeah, low insulin and then probably enough, I guess, enough dietary fat. Well, of course, with fasting, it goes up too. So
Yeah,
it's not
no,
even
you don't need
necessarily,
dietary fat. My
yeah.
LDL will go up with just fasting. So if you're taking in
Mhm.
zero fat, in fact, Sean Baker did this where he's not a lean mass hyperresponder, but the physiology again, like physiology doesn't care about the cut points. The physiology can still be applied. So, if Sean Baker like fasts and then does a workout, his LDL will skyrocket.
Mm,
I think it went from like the 100s to like his total cholesterol. I don't quote me on this, but I think it was like around
yeah,
150. We were talking about this the other day. And if he fasts and does a workout, like in a couple days, it can jump to over 300.
right.
So just showing that like these are dynamic shifts
Yeah.
and probably to meet fuel demand.
Yeah, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And so understanding that is key because LDL is looked at in the cardiology world again as this really strong independent risk factor, or they'll look at
ApoB.
ApoB, right? As
Yeah.
total particles as this really strong risk factor. And I think it's pretty well put out in the research that the terrible triad, which would be high LDL, high triglycerides, right? So lean mass hyperresponder has low triglycerides, but the terrible triad, which is high triglycerides and then low HDL, so kind of
Yeah.
that reverse there. I think it's pretty well looked at, pretty well understood that that combination is a very strong risk factor.
Yeah. I think this is where it's hard to communicate the nuances without people having a degree of background because there's a lot of
Yeah.
jargon we use, things like necessary, sufficient, causal, and they all tend to get confused. One point I would like to make that I do think gets confused a lot in social media is we can talk about LDL particles. And LDL cholesterol is kind of a weak man's proxy for the LDL particles. You mentioned ApoB.
Yeah.
ApoB is the apolipoprotein on LDL particles, so it's similar to the LDL particle count,
Hmm.
although there's ApoB on some other particles like VLDL and LP little a, another topic. But bottom line, I would say the literature does show, and people get defensive about this comment, but that it is causal, as in it's part of the causal cascade. So if you don't have LDL particles, you won't get ASCVD. But just because something's causal doesn't mean it is a large magnitude predictor relative to other things. And just because something else is not causal doesn't mean it's not relevant to look at. So things like the high triglycerides and the low HDL, even if triglycerides and HDL aren't causal, the patterns that we see can be predictive of outcomes. I think what is often missed is people like to take a tunnel vision focus on a marker. Often because, I mean, it's easier to target that marker. We have drugs that can just target LDL, target ApoB, and so they become the narrow focus. But what we really care about with respect to metabolic disease, and cardiovascular disease is a metabolic disease, is what is the root cause physiology? What's going on with respect to metabolism? Because if we want to treat it, we should address the root cause. And that root cause or what's going on, let's say, metabolically in an individual can be intuited. We can gain some insight by not looking at single markers, but looking at patterns of markers. And this isn't specific just to, say, LDL, but a topic we were talking about in association. This is a whole different rabbit hole. People can see my video on this if they want to look at metabolic vulnerability. But one thing we talked about, me and Professor Cromwell, if you really want to deep dive on that, you can listen to the 5-hour podcast I have with Simon Hill. Is that like there's a multi-marker, this metabolic vulnerability score. Now, each of the components aren't necessarily causal, but you combine them and what you get is a signature that suggests something that is going on under the surface. So I know that was a lot of words and rambling, but I do want to dissect that something can be causal and maybe not the most important thing in the world, and something else can not be causal and actually be very informative.